So, all right. So the first of the four that we are going to focus on, for the Transcendentalists, they called it contemplation. Ralph Waldo Emerson described this as keeping a religious eye turned to this upward light, attending to it with lowly expectation. What a great combination of humility and lifting the eyes. And then he describes in his essay, Human Culture, he says, the simple habit of sitting alone occasionally to explore what facts of moment lie in the memory may have the effect, in some more favored hour, to open to the student the kingdom of spiritual nature. He goes on in his inimitable style, but he says that we will notice it is illuminated with meaning, that every fact is magical, every atom alive, and that each of us is the heir of it all. Now we are adapting his idea of contemplation to a more disciplined approach to meditation. And if any of you have been listening to KP's teachings on meditation, you'll know what riches lie ahead in this. He will be leading a group in meditation once monthly in July and August. So that's our first one, contemplation, or as we're looking at it, meditation. Our second one is reading. The Transcendentalists were big on reading, and they were specifically interested in reading for spiritual insights. Emerson called these spiritual insights lusters. I love that, like the luster of stars. The Transcendentalists were so serious about this that many of them kept separate journals, just cataloging all of their reading. And in it, they read across a wide breadth of types of literature, poetry, philosophy, mythology, science, history, biography. But Thoreau once said, books must be read as deliberately and reservedly as they were written. So I want to say, as somebody who's written a couple books, and it always takes me a bigger chunk of my life than I ever would have thought to write a single book, that if we bring the same attention to reading them, we have to open ourselves up to receiving in a way that is different than the way that we read for factual knowledge. This spiritual reading is about not assuming we know what we will get from the reading. And so for this practice, our small group will be using the practice of lectio divina, which is a long-standing spiritual practice of reading scripture or poetry based on the Benedictines, who used this quite a bit. And this practice is about listening to the oral reading of a poem and in a group, noticing what rises from it. You can learn more about that from Shelley Butler and Deb Cushman, who will be leading those two groups. And so that is one of our offerings. There's a quote about Lectio Divina that I'll share with you. This is from Macrina Wiederkehr, a Benedictine, who says, this is about reading with a vulnerable heart. Expect to be blessed in the reading. Read as one awake, one waiting for the beloved. Read with reverence. It's that kind of reading. It's not speedy, but it is very rich and fruitful. The third spiritual practice that we will be offering is writing. For the Transcendentalists, they were specifically interested in journal writing. Emerson wrote, Pay so much honor to the visits of truth in your mind as to record those thoughts that have shone therein. It is not for what is recorded, he said, though that may be the agreeable entertainment for later years, but for the habit of rendering account to yourself of yourself in some more rigorous manner, and at certain intervals than mere conversation or casual reverie of solitude require. He was very serious about his journals. There is a way in which I like to think of spiritual writing as a correspondence with the soul, with our heart, with the holy, with deep meaning. And so here's another quote from Thoreau that I love about correspondence. And remember, he was writing this in the day when they actually had 2 deliveries to the post office a day. So he says, when our life ceases to be inward and private, conversation degenerates into mere gossip. In proportion as our inward life fails, we go more constantly and desperately to the post office. You may depend on it that the poor fellow who walks away with the greatest number of letters, proud of his extensive correspondence, has not heard from himself for a very long while. That was one thing for them, but if you think of how many times we check our email today, our phones, our texts, how many times are we going to the post office to see what other people have sent to us without even checking in with what our heart is trying to tell us? Writing as a spiritual practice is about opening that correspondence first and about writing it down on the page. So for this spiritual practice, our small group will be looking at the practice of contemplative correspondence. And Mary Barrymore will be leading a group on that practice, and she'll be using the book that I wrote about that practice. And so some of you may be familiar with that, but this will be a group use of writing prompts in that book and a beautiful way to experience that together. So that's our third one. Our fourth one is conversation. Conversation. Bronson Alcott of the Transcendentalists said, conversation is the natural organ of communication, mind with mind. It is the method of human culture. By it, he said, I come nearer to the hearts of those to whom I address than by any other means. Now, the little bit that I know about Bronson Alcott makes me sort of notice that he said in this, those whom he addresses rather than those whom he listens to. And I will say that as we look at the spiritual practice of conversation, we are putting deep emphasis on listening. And there will be speaking in it, but they are both as important, one as important to the other. Of course, Margaret Fuller was another of the Transcendentalists who worked with conversations, and hers were specifically intended to help women become more adept at participating in the conversations of the day. And so she had very disciplined conversations, preparing women to not only be emboldened and more practiced to speak up and speak out, but to have the knowledge at their fingertips, on the tip of their tongue, I should have said. So that was her use of conversation. As I said, our adaptation of this really puts heavy emphasis on the listening. And That is the really challenged part of conversation in our own culture. So we practice listening and speaking from the heart. Brenda Euland, the writer, once wrote these suggestions about listening that I think are a good description of how we'll be using conversation and listening. She said, "In order to listen, here are some suggestions. Try to learn tranquility. To live in the present a part of the time every day. Sometimes say to yourself, now, what is happening now? This friend is talking. I am quiet. There is endless time. I hear it. Every word." Then suddenly you begin to hear not only what people are saying, but also what they are trying to say. And you sense the whole truth about them. This, friends, is the kind of conversation that our small groups are cultivating. And they will be modeled after the Chalice Circles that many of you have been a part of. And the two leaders who will be offering those are Mike Funk and Jim Mulvey. And these will be modifications of our Chalice Circle practice in that there won't be preparation for it. You'll sign up, you'll show up, and they will lead a practice of deep listening and speaking from the heart. So those are our 4 practices.